Welcome to Voratix Stage, where ideas, experiences, expertise come to life. Today, we are joined by Aaron W. Beverly, the 2019 Toastmasters World Champion of Public Speaking. So, let's get into this. Aaron, before we begin, could you tell us who you are and what do you do now?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Right now, I am a newly minted pro speaker, coach, and trainer. I was, up until this past Monday, a managing consultant at Deloitte, but I realized what my passion truly was. My passion was communication. My passion was training people in the art of communication. So I decided to take a leap and go pro. It's been interesting so far, but I feel like more and more as the days go by that this was the right decision for me. But before that, communication has been the basis of my career. Ever since I started in college, when I joined an organization called Toastmasters International, I have always been communicating. I've always been in the arena of speaking. So even throughout my career, I was always finding ways to communicate, to learn how to express myself. And because I got better at communicating and expressing myself, I feel that that made my career go on an upward trajectory. I credit a lot of my personal success, my career success to my ability to speak. And I've realized that communication is one of the foundations of life, especially for us as humans in society. We need to communicate with one another to move society forward. So those who are able to communicate that better are the ones who get ahead.
You quit your consultancy job recently, but you've been public speaking for a really long time. So, how did you find this passion? And did you have this when you were younger?
I had the desire when I was younger. However, what I realized is that I didn't have the securities. So I know a lot of people say follow your passions, follow your dreams, but I'm a more logical person. I'm also a very risk averse person. So I want to follow my passions. I want to follow my dreams, but I know that I need the security to do so. So security for me means having the financial standing to do that. Whenever you're jumping into entrepreneurship, it's usually said that you need to have at least a year or two worth of savings so that you can weather a storm, because it's going to take you some time to build up clientele. It's going to take you some time to build up the amount of security for that business. And some people are really good. They can open up day one and boom, they're making a living. Other people, it takes more time. I don't know how much time it's going to take me, but at the very least, I know that I have at least a couple of years worth of savings where I can just go full steam ahead, heads down, and try to accomplish this new goal.
Did anything happen in particular for you to quit your stable job?
It wasn't a decision that just came this past Monday. That was something that I had been thinking about, honestly, for the last year and a half, I would say, is when I really started to consider it. And I was considering it because I realized that I wasn't happy with where I was. So I have a banking and finance background. That's what I went to school for. I went to school for business administration with a minor in finance. So I wanted to get into business when I came out of college. But as I got closer to corporate business, as I got closer to finance, I realized that it wasn't really something that I enjoyed. It was something that I could do. It was something that I could do well. And then when I advanced in my career and went into project management, I was able to utilize a little bit more of my communication skills. I was able to utilize a little bit more of my organization skills, but I still wasn't fully happy. The material that I was working on wasn't something that excited me. I didn't wake up in the morning thinking, oh boy, I can't wait to read about finances. I can't wait to read about economies. I can't wait to read about treasury. I really didn't care about that stuff, what I realized was that I really loved personal finance.
Mm.
I joke with people, half joking, I should say, that I didn't care about other people's money. I didn't care about the bank's money. I cared about my money and how I could utilize it for my sake. So that wasn't a place where I thought I was thriving anymore
Mm.
because of that thought process, because of that mindset. So I wanted to go to an arena where I could have a mindset where I wake up in the morning and I can't wait to read this book about communication. I can't wait to read this article about communication. So now that I'm here, I feel like this is where I need to be because this is what excites me.
Do you think graduating in the economic crisis contributed to this? Did you then see public speaking as an investment?
At the time, I knew it was, I didn't deliberately think it was an investment at the time,
Mm.
but I knew it was important to get ahead. I knew it was important to stand out. When I first joined that organization, Toastmasters, I was afraid of public speaking. I wanted nothing to do with public speaking. It was the last thing that I wanted. I was always a shy person. I was an introvert, or I am an introvert,
Mm.
and I wanted to be in the background. If I had to be in front of people, it just brought all types of emotions that I didn't want. The negative emotions, so the anxiety, the fear. I didn't want that. But financial crisis, all the jobs that I thought I was going to get when I graduated from college, I no longer had those. Those were off the table. So there were fewer jobs available, and I needed to find a way to stand out from all of the people who were graduating at the time. One of the ways to stand out was public speaking. I remember hearing that Warren Buffett quote that he gives about public speaking, that is the best skill that you can learn. I also was inspired by Barack Obama, who had won the presidency in 2008. I saw his ability to speak to people, to inspire people, and I said to myself, I want that ability. I was also lucky to have a really good mentor who was an adjunct professor at my school, who just so happened to be a former president of Toastmasters International. So I decided that these people have this skill and they've advanced so much because of this skill. This is something that I need to learn. This is something that I need to hone. So I didn't see it as an investment, but I knew it was extremely important.
Can you think back to something that your mentor said to you that really stuck out?
Find your voice, serve your world. So my mentor's name is Dilip Abesekara. He was the 2005-2006 president of Toastmasters International. That was something that he had used as his theme for his presidential year. And he would quote it whenever I was in his classes. And what it meant to me was everyone has their own unique voice. Everyone has their own unique message. What is that specifically for you? And when you find what that is, then you can serve the people who are looking for guidance in that area. So that's the your world part. Your world doesn't necessarily mean the entire world. It means find your message, find your voice for the people who need guidance from you. That one's always stuck with me, but he also gave me some very candid advice. One other thing that has stuck with me was his first feedback on the first speech that I gave him to review. And I remember him telling me that, Aaron, this could win round one of a contest. It could win round two of a contest. Maybe this will not make it past round three. And just for a little bit of context, the Toastmasters International Speech Contest is 7 rounds. So that stuck with me, and it made me realize that, okay, the talent that I think that I have isn't going to be enough at this time. I need to find ways to get better.
What's your principle on life or philosophies?
I mean, I have many philosophies, but one for me that I would say that there's no such thing as the way. There's only a way, and it's up to you to find your way. That was something that I learned throughout all of my years of competing in the Toastmasters International Speech Contest and in other contests that I've participated in, we think that we have to be perfect all the time. And we think that perfection is defined as one particular way. For instance, if somebody wins the World Championship of Public Speaking, there are a bunch of people who want to copy what won because they think that that is the way. But what they don't understand is that there are many nuances. There are things that make us unique. So what you need to do instead is think about, how can I showcase my uniqueness? How can I bring forth my message that I want to give to my world? So that's something that I try to teach people, because they're always aiming for perfection. And I've tried to aim for perfection because there was this one standard that I saw back in the day. But what I've realized is that it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to learn, because when you make those mistakes, when you learn, that's when you start to find yourself more and more. And that's when you start to find your specific way.
When you were competing, did you do something early on that set you miles ahead?
It wasn't something that I started doing. I would say that when I first started, I was just going off of sheer talent. I don't know what else to call it. I would practice and I would practice. Again, trying to reach that level of perfection. To give you some background, because I was an introvert, because I was afraid of public speaking, because I had anxiety, I practiced my first speech 24 hours straight because I was so afraid of messing up. Now, that's not really something that you should do, but that's what I was willing to do to find that level of what I deemed perfection at the time. And when I did that, I realized I was good at it. So I guess one thing that I would say that I did, now that I'm thinking about it and articulating it now, was that I would devote the time. I devoted the time to practice. I devoted the time to get better. A lot of people think that they come into a situation and they're only going to need to do this for a day, a few minutes, a few hours. But that's not the case. This was a marathon. It wasn't a sprint. So that's the one thing that I would say. I was always willing to devote the time to get better, but it came from a place of wanting to avoid anxiety and wanting to avoid embarrassment. When I started competing, I realized that there was more than just perfecting the words that I wrote out. I needed to tell proper stories. I needed to engage my audience. I needed to tell personal stories about myself so that I could give the audience evidence that the thing that I'm talking about, I've actually lived, I've actually experienced. It's the days of us giving motivation just for motivation's sake. So you should do better just because. That's not really going to work anymore. It worked 30 years ago, not so much today. So that was a lesson that I learned, but again, I applied that time to get better at it.
Do you think beginners get trapped in that sense of perfection?
Absolutely. It's difficult to manage sometimes because you do want to do your best. Nobody ever wants to get on stage and say, I want to give as crappy of a job as possible, at least not if they're serious. So we try to practice and practice and practice until we can get it so perfect. But a lot of times when we try for perfection, we're going to frustrate ourselves because in our mind, we have this picture of perfection. But when we articulate it, when we put it out into the world, it doesn't sound like or doesn't look like what we had in our mind. So that's part of the dark side of competition, in my eyes, from my years of competing, because you get into your head that this has to be perfect, but there's really no such thing as a perfect speech. Additionally, there's no such thing as a perfect speech for every person. So you have to really understand that it's okay to make those mistakes. And a lot of times there's gold in the mistakes. one story about a mistake that ended up turning into gold that comes up to mind was back in 2016. So I won the world championship in 2019, but 2016 I won second place. And that year I had a speech that was 57 words long, or sorry, a title of my speech that was 57 words long. And I remember one time when I was practicing, the MC or the master of ceremony for the day was reading my title. It was getting the laughs that I wanted. But when I got on stage, I noticed a problem. The microphone was too low for me. So this was a mistake. Like, it should have been raised up. And I'm just trying to stall for time. And I tried to think of the first thing that came to my head. This wasn't something that I practiced. It was just something I was trying to do out of sheer survival. So I said the first thing that came to my mind. I said, "Be honest," as I'm trying to adjust the mic. "You enjoyed that, didn't you?" And people laughed. And I thought, oh, wow, that was interesting. So I tried it deliberately another time, and people laughed again. And I said to myself, okay, this is actually good material that needs to make it into the final speech. So because of a mistake, because I didn't adjust the mic or didn't ask for the mic to be adjusted before, and I had to stall for time, it turned into something that became a highlight of my 2016 speech. So perfection isn't always necessary. It's the mistakes that can lead into gold.
How do you use humor in your speeches?
Humor for me didn't come easily. It was something that I had to enhance over time. And again, it was something that I wasn't good at. So I had to practice and make mistakes, learn what people thought was funny, and learn by trial and error what they didn't think was funny. I remember there was one time when I was trying to incorporate humor into my speeches, and one of my friends at the time came up to me and she said, "Aaron, you know what? Humor just isn't your thing." And it was interesting because it was feedback that, okay, you say humor isn't my thing, but I am a part of this organization because I want to get better. So just to simply tell me that humor isn't my thing, okay, thank you for your feedback, but I can't do anything with that. So I need to keep practicing so that I can get better at it. So it wasn't something that I necessarily wanted to become known for. I just wanted to get better at it because I know humor is one of the best ways for us to establish connection with one another.
So, why wasn't humor your thing in the beginning?
It wasn't my thing in the beginning because I was trying to force it. There were certain things that I thought was funny that other people didn't find funny. And that's when I had to realize that there's more of an art to humor. And it really depends on your audience. Knowing your audience is the golden rule of public speaking. And when you're speaking with different audiences, they're going to have different feelings. So for a Toastmasters audience is typically more conservative. So if I go on stage and I try to be a comedian in a nighttime comedy club, that's not going to do so well at Toastmasters because they don't really enjoy vulgar language. They don't really enjoy things that are more sensitive. So I had to adjust my style. I had to clean up my humor a little bit more. And I had to learn what other people thought was funny. And that came from just being a scientist. So going into the lab, which the lab for me is my stage, and there's something that I think is funny, but let's test it out, see what the audience thinks. Sometimes the audience laughs and I take note of that. And then there are times when the audience doesn't laugh and I take note of that. But that's what helps me get better over time. I know the style of humor that works with this Toastmaster audience because I really studied what made a Toastmasters audience laugh.
Did you ever doubt yourself or the value of public speaking?
There were multiple times. And I'll give you two examples, one through the contest and then one professionally. In 2018, I competed again in the international speech contest. By 2018, I had been established as a known entity in the international speech contest. After winning second place in 2016, I have been a multiple time semifinalist, a multiple time winner of my district, which for context, think of it as a statewide, or for us, it would be a tri-state. But anyway, I felt like I was getting better as a speaker, but my results were getting less and less. And I really started to doubt myself. I wondered if I was ever going to win the World Championship of Public Speaking. I doubted whether I was good enough to win the World Championship of Public Speaking. Then when I decided to change my mentality and I focused on growth, that was when I won the World Championship of Public Speaking that very next year. Just a shifting of that mentality. Then professionally, I doubted myself going pro, because in the back of my mind, as I was thinking about this before my resignation, I thought to myself, there's no way that people want to listen to me. There's no way that people really think that I'm more skilled of a speaker than some of these other speakers out in the world. So there was a lot of imposter syndrome, and I doubted whether I would be able to do this professionally. But one thing that I realized is that a lot of the things that I got from the contest, they were transferable to what I was going through in real life. So I needed to have that mentality shift. I needed to shift my mindset to one of growth. And when I focus on just growing, following the direct next step, trying to find one little thing to make better, I feel like that's the recipe for being a great professional speaker, just as it was for being a great competitive speaker.
And just on growth, what do you think separates a good speaker and a great one?
Out of all the things, the one word that's coming to my mind right now is time. You need to put in the time. Regardless of how skilled you are, regardless of how unskilled you are, you need to devote the time to get better at a craft. I know the standard that goes out there for mastery is 10,000 hours. You need to be able to devote the time to get to those 10,000 hours, because that shows that you have the dedication. And if you devote the time and you're consciously trying your best to learn, trying consciously to do better, results are guaranteed to be good. It may not be the result that you want specifically, but you're going to get positive results if you devote the time. There are other nuances and factors. For instance, we were talking about security a little bit before. You don't want to do things without safety, in my opinion. But again, that's coming from a person who's very risk averse. But time is incredibly important if you want to develop that mastery. That's what makes a great speaker.
Okay, so moving on to the limitations of competition and redefining what success really is. How do you overall see competition?
I see competition now as a gauge. And what I mean by that is when we're competing, usually we want to just win the trophy. We want to be the best. But what does that really mean? What are you trying to be the best for? Especially when we're talking about something like communication. We're not talking about a sport, for instance. I can want to win the championship in basketball, for instance. But that's the end goal. Once I win the championship, then the only thing that I can do is win more championships. So it's all about winning the trophy at the top there. But for the speech contest, yes, you can compete, you can win trophies, but communication is such an essential skill for life. What else are you doing with it? So, one thing that I've realized is that if I can improve my communication skills, I can now go into this competition and start testing things out. I can start testing out messages that I care about. I can start testing out different styles of speaking if I want to. And then I can use that as a gauge for how good my communication is. And from there, I can take those lessons that I've learned, engaged through the contest, and apply them to real life. And I know this because that's what I did. I did it not necessarily deliberately all the time, but when I competed in the contest and I learned how to tailor my message to my audience, or I learned how to be humorous to a particular audience, you can do the same thing for any interpersonal interaction that you have. So you can do that at work. Knowing your audience, the golden rule of know your audience, is still applies. So these were the transferable skills that I got from the contest. And it made me realize that, okay, the power of the contest is using it as a gauge of your communication skills and a testing ground for your communication skills, not necessarily as an end of winning the world championship. Winning the world championship for me isn't the end. The contest itself was a means to a greater end that I'm continuing to find.
Based on that, what are some things competition actively worked against or simply not teach?
That's a good question. I think competition doesn't teach you what is valuable. And here's what I mean by that. Again, a lot of people get focused on the end goal or the end dream of winning the championship. But the championship doesn't have as much value as you think. Yes, it is a tremendous achievement. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to downplay the world championship of public speaking. But at the same time, I was a valuable speaker before I won the world championship. There are more professional speakers who are multimillionaires than there are world champions of public speaking. So there's a large group of people who have found ways to establish value. A lot of times when people enter speech competitions, they view winning as their value. Winning a contest doesn't establish your value. Again, we need to treat it more as a gauge rather than treat it as the goal itself. Because when you try to equate winning with your value, whenever you don't win, you feel like you're a failure. And yes, you may have lost. I'm not a person that likes to mince words. So when you don't place first, yes, I agree that it's a loss, technically. But there are also wins within that loss, if that makes sense. So there are lessons that you can learn. There are things you can infer from a loss. You learn more from losing than you do from winning, is the cliche. So that's what I would say, that the contest doesn't teach value, and it shouldn't. So, and the mistake a lot of people make is that they put too much value on Toastmasters contests establishing their value.
What would you say to people still stuck in a transit competition, believing that winning would still give them the value?
You need to find an ulterior goal, or you need to understand what your bigger picture is. So, okay, you have a goal. You come to me and you say, I want to win the world championship of public speaking. The first question that I'm going to ask, why? What is winning the world championship going to do that you cannot already do? And usually when I give people this question, they struggle a little bit because in their mind, they were always thinking like, I just need to win the world championship because I want the recognition, I want the fame, I want the glory, etc. These were all things that I thought before too. That's what I wanted. But over time, because I learned that winning doesn't necessarily establish your value as a speaker or as a person. So to get out of that, you really need to understand what is the why. What is the reason why you're doing what you're doing? Is it because you want to get a certain job? Is it because you want to be a pro speaker? Is it because you have a particular message that you want to share with a broader audience? What is that bigger picture goal? If you find that, that's going to be a way for you to drive that'll be a fuel for your passion, and it'll be fuel for competing. And that's when you can start to use the contest more so as a gauge instead of as the ultimate goal.
How did you find your why?
For me, finding my why. Finding my why started during that transition, that mindset shift in 2018. And it was because of the contest speeches that I selected that year. I had a theme, and my theme was unity. So both of the speeches that I gave that year were all about unity. The first speech that I gave was a speech about sharing family stories, because everyone has family, and we realize that a lot of people have similar family stories. And those are the greatest stories that we've ever heard, because they can cause people to unite. They can cause people to relate to one another. And then in the World Championship speech, I talked about an experience that I had attending a wedding in India. And the message there was about sharing your culture with other people who don't look like you, and accepting people despite their differences. So those were speeches that I really cared about. And that made me realize that having a deeper message, having a deeper reason of why you want to get on that stage and speak, that just makes you feel better about what it is that you're doing. So that's when I really started to understand my why of sharing a message that I really cared about. And since then, it's evolved into other whys. And the why that I'm going with now is because I believe that communication, again, is a foundation of life. It's an essential skill that can skyrocket your career. And I know that because I've experienced it. So now that's what I am driving toward, and why I tell people, like, get into competitive speaking, because there are ways for you to advance your life, advance your career by using the contest as a gauge.
Then what should we focus on instead to hone our craft?
I think you need to focus less on what you feel is good and go off of what the audience is telling you is good. And here's what I mean by that. I'm not saying you need to comply to every piece of feedback that audience members give you. There are a lot of people who will come up to you and give you unsolicited feedback on a presentation. Some people, they have the best intentions, but they may not be the person that you would want to get that advice from. So that's not what I mean by letting the audience tell you. What I mean by letting the audience tell you what works is their reactions, their live reactions. So if you think that you have this funny killer line, you give it and the audience does not respond at all, then you need to think about changing that approach to your humor, change the wording, change the delivery, change something, because the audience is telling you that that doesn't work. So you allow the audience to tell you what is working for them and what isn't. And then too, when they're reacting to different things that you say, the audience is giving you this live feedback. And if you see people consistently going to sleep during your speech, for instance, then maybe that's telling you that you need to be a little bit more engaging, or you need to be have a little bit more active participation, or you need to not necessarily have a lecture style of speaking and have more of a storytelling style of speaking. So the audience will always decide. That was one thing that I learned from one of my mentors.
Then how do you know which audience feedback to listen to?
This is something that is, it takes multiple approaches, or it has multiple approaches. So I like to have different, what I call feedback filters. So the first feedback filter is just my personal intuition. So I have a lot of experience as a speaker now. So I now have more of a speaker's intuition. So if somebody comes up to me and they give me feedback on a speech and they tell me to do something. I remember one feedback that I got in the past was that I need to sing a song on the stage, or I need to bring out huge props or dress a certain way in a costume. I didn't feel good about doing that. I felt it was too gimmicky. I could give that entire speech and it doesn't enhance it in any way. Or sorry, I can give that entire speech without doing that and it doesn't change the speech at all. So it really adds nothing to the speech. So my intuition was telling me that singing on stage or wearing a certain costume that looked goofy and would evoke humor, that wasn't something that I wanted to do. So intuition is one, and my personal favorite is what I call my circle of counsel. So I like to say that I am the judge, the jury, and executioner for my speech content. Everyone else, they're just a lawyer trying to present their case. So I am the person that makes the ultimate decision. However, there are people who I give permission to also act as judge, jury, and executioner. And these are people that I trust. These are people that know me. So in my championship year, I had 3 people in my circle of counsel. One was my mentor, Dilip Abesekara, and his job was to tell me fundamentally, what am I doing well? What am I not doing well with speaking? Or what pieces, or I give him pieces of feedback and he can tell me what pieces of feedback are good and which pieces of feedback are not good, because he also has that experience. But then I also had, as a part of my counsel, my mother and my sister. Their role was different. Their role wasn't to tell me about the fundamentals of speaking because they're not as experienced as I am or as Dilip is in speaking. Their job was to tell me, if I'm on that stage, is that the same Aaron Beverly that you interact with every day? Yes, it will be a little bit more polished, a little bit more rehearsed, but am I the same person on stage as I am when we talk at the family table, at the dinner table? So those are different pieces or different feedback filters that I utilize. But the last one that I'll tell you is time. I'm a person who personally does not like feedback. I believe that when I create a speech, I see those speeches as my children. And how dare somebody come up to me and tell me that my children are not perfect in every single way? So that's my pride speaking. I need to allow time to pass for my pride to dissipate so that I can think about feedback objectively. So I will never apply any feedback immediately. I always think about it because that'll allow these emotions to subside so that I can think about it more clearly. And then I can determine with my intuition whether it is solid feedback or whether it's not.
How do you balance this pride initially, and how do you develop this intuition?
Through practice and through repetition. It's not something that you're necessarily going to get in theory. Public speaking, you can learn as much theory about public speaking as you want. And you can understand the fundamentals in your head. That's all great. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that. You definitely should. But if you think that that's going to make you a great speaker alone, it's not. You need to have the exposure therapy. You need to actually get into the arena. Just as you're not going to get bulky by just sitting on your butt all day. You need to go into the gym. You can watch all the videos about working out, but unless you actually work out, you're not going to receive the benefit. Same thing for public speaking. You can learn the theories, you can watch the videos, but you actually have to get up and speak.
Just on storytelling within speeches, why do you think it is so essential? And can you share an example of a story that really hit deep?
Storytelling is a way for us to connect. throughout history, we have always loved stories. When we were kids, we loved to have stories read to us. We love stories in the form of movies and TV shows. We are wired for stories. Stories also were a survival mechanism back in prehistoric times because we needed to tell stories about how to avoid danger, how to avoid that saber-toothed tiger, or where to find the best shelter. We needed to tell these stories to each other because that's how we conveyed information. So when we are telling stories, it's how we connect, is how we best learn, in my opinion, because we are reliving somebody else's experience. So it's a way for us to get their experience. And there are other types of stories, just stories for pure entertainment and things like that. But the essentials of storytelling, that's where I think that's where the foundations are. So for me, one of my favorite personal stories is one that really hit me deep, was a story that I gave in 2016. And it's interesting because it's a story about someone else's story. When I was in one of my Toastmaster chapter meetings, there was a young girl from China named Michelle, and she was terrified of speaking. You could tell she was terrified of speaking. But one day she gets up for an impromptu speech. She gets the question, what was the most amazing moment of your life? And I remember watching her slowly, seemingly lose confidence. She just stood there for what must have felt like eternity to her. And then she started to cry. And I'm looking at her up there doing this, and I'm feeling heartbroken. I want to get up and tell her that it's okay. You can sit down. You don't have to do it. But then she said only a few words, and it made me realize why she was really crying. The most amazing moment of her life was when her mother said she believed in her. And I just thought, wow, that's so powerful, that just being told I believe in you is enough to give you that much emotion. It's something that will stick with you for probably a lifetime, because it stuck with me. I heard that, how long ago? About 10 years ago, and I still remember that. So that's the power of storytelling. We're living somebody's experience. Even when we're telling the experience secondhand, it's just a way for us to connect with people. So I connected with Michelle that day because of her story. When I gave that speech in 2016 and I told that story, the audience was connecting with me because they were experiencing the emotion that I was feeling that day. And then they were also connected to Michelle, who they had never met. So storytelling is a way for us to connect with one another, even if we're telling someone else's story.
So, based on this, how do you find your stories and what do you do to retain them?
One thing that I do is I try my best to journal every single day. Now, it's a habit that honestly, I don't do it every day. I'm trying to do it every day. So it's one of those things where I try for progress, not perfection. But one thing that I do in my journaling prompts is called my story-worthy prompt. So what is one story that stood out on this day? And I write it down and I put that idea in my story bank. Eventually, what I'll do whenever I have an idea for content or I have an idea for a speech, I'll go through my story bank to see if I have any ideas for stories that could be fleshed out to fit into this piece of larger content. So for me, it's really just making sure that I get these ideas down. And then eventually, when I come back to them, I'm going to flesh out the stories a little bit more. And there's no perfect way to tell a story. So I just try to ask myself, okay, what actually happened? So just baseline, what happened. Don't try to fluff it up. Don't try to make it amazing on the first draft. Just tell me exactly what happened in this story. And that could be an outline, or you can try to write it out entirely if you have it all in your head at that time. But that's what I try to get. So journaling every day, adding to my story bank. I have a inventory of speeches, or sorry, inventory of stories that I can use for speeches.
Have you seen moments when a speaker's technical skill mattered less than the truth of what they were saying?
Oh, absolutely. There are people who are fundamentally sound. They, if you, if there is a such thing as a perfect speaker, these are the people that are just so fundamentally great. They say the exact right words. They do the exact right gestures. But sometimes it feels like something's missing. Like there's something blocking us from the real person, that authentic, that raw person. Then you have somebody else who isn't as technically sound. The fundamentals of their speaking are lacking in some places, but they hit us emotionally because we feel what they're saying, because they feel what they're saying. There's so much emotion, and there's emotion and there is passion in their words. So when we have people who are passionate about what they're saying and they have emotion in what they're saying, we connect with them. We want them to succeed. We want them to win in the end. And we think that it's extremely brave that they're being vulnerable, that they are telling us this story so that they can help others maybe not struggle the same way that they struggle. One example that I'll give of that was a former world champion. Her name was LaShonda Runnels. And her world championship speech was a good speech. But if you break it down in its fundamentals, it wasn't as well put together as other championship speeches have been. But the story that she told, she had a terminal illness. So she knew that she was going to pass away, but she was still on that stage. She was still telling this story. And she connected with everyone in that audience. And she was a well-deserved world champion of public speaking. Even though all of the technical skills weren't there, she still was able to connect with the audience and drive them emotionally. And that's something that's a key. It's a key for speaking. When you can have all of the fundamentals, you can have all the technical skill, but it's really about connecting with that audience. If you can have a little bit of technical skill, you don't need to be perfect there, but if you hit them with that emotion, you're going to be much more powerful than a person who just relies all on the technical skill.
How do you balance authenticity, and can it ever be too much?
I like to say that there are certain things that the audience gives you permission to do and what they don't give you permission to do. So when I come out on the stage, 9 times out of 10, the audience doesn't really know me. So if I immediately come out of the gate and I tell you my deepest, darkest secret, the audience is likely not going to accept that, because they didn't give me permission to do that. They didn't give me permission to establish that deep of a connection yet. So I need to build rapport with them. I need to build up into that. There are a lot of people who will just go full speed ahead and try to go deep into the emotion, and it falls flat because you didn't give the audience any context. You didn't really let the audience get to know you before you gave them that information. Another way is that they give too much information. There are certain things that in certain environments should not be told on a stage. For instance, we always hear, do not talk about sex, politics, or religion. And these are called the taboo topics. Some people will ignore that and they'll go full steam ahead and they're going to talk about their religion and what it means to them. They're going to try to evangelize on a contest stage, for instance. And it's a choice. It's a personal choice that people make. But if there is a desire to win the contest, then it's likely that's not going to win that contest, or that's not going to win over that audience because they didn't necessarily come for that. So you didn't necessarily know your audience well enough. There are some occasions where that is perfectly acceptable and you can go deep, you can go into those taboo topics, but you need to find the right audience. So it's a combination of what I was saying before. Knowing your audience is the golden rule, and then the audience will tell you what works and what doesn't.
What are some tips you can tell people who are just beginning public speaking?
Well, the first tip that I'll give you is to speak. It's as simple as that. Again, you can watch all the videos, you can watch this video, but that alone is not going to make you a better speaker. You have to actually get up and speak. So you have to find opportunities where you can speak, whether that is joining a Toastmasters club, whether it's going to a Dale Carnegie course, whether it's raising your hand to ask a question at work or school. Find a way to start speaking up and start learning what works and what doesn't. So that's the first tip. Stand up, speak up. The next one I would say is to be a sponge. See other styles of speaking. One of the best things that I ever did was looking at other speakers, not just the world champions of public speaking, not just looking at the top communicators in the world, but looking at the communicators that aren't as good, because I can learn what I don't want to do from them. So be a sponge and learn from other speakers. And what you'll probably find is that there are other styles of speaking that you can incorporate because they feel natural to you or they seem fun to you. My style of speaking evolved because I started studying different comedians. So that is another thing that I'll say. Be a sponge, learn from other speakers. And then lastly, I would say, this is just me speaking. I know a lot of people don't necessarily thrive in doing this, but I write out as much as possible. So like I said, I try to journal every day. And as part of my journaling, I try to write out the thoughts in my head. I try to write out the stories that are in my head. And documenting things is important for me because there's so much in my head that if I have an idea and I just try to rely on my mind, it's going to get lost. I'll eventually lose the thought, but having that content written down where I can see it every day, then it's going to be cemented more. It's something that I can constantly refer back to. So I would say to start writing, start journaling, start documenting, and that way you're building your inventory.
How would you describe the evolution of your speaking style?
I would say when I first started speaking, I spoke at a much slower pace because I was trying to emulate my mentor who spoke at a slower pace. But what I quickly realized was that I was speaking way too slow. And as a native English speaker, I had the advantage of being able to speak faster and still be understood. My mentor, English is his second language. So I had to realize that there are things that are more suitable for me that aren't suitable for my mentor and vice versa. So that's when I started to really learn from other speakers. And then I tried to be more of the rah-rah type and speak fast and speak loud like a Tony Robbins type. And I realized that that wasn't my style either. It wasn't something that I enjoyed doing, even though I could do it. Then I tried to do something a little bit more clever, a little bit more poetic. I remember giving a speech where the analogy was the Three Little Pigs, but I used it more so as talking about dreams that I had and how life just blew things down. And it was good. It ended up winning multiple rounds in the contest, but it also wasn't me. After I gave that speech, I started to learn the power of personal stories. So I started to share a personal story. And the personal story that I gave at the time was about a bad dating experience. And it didn't do as well that next year as other speeches had done. But the feedback that I was getting from the audience was that this was the best speech that I had ever given. So the audience was telling me that this was good. So I decided to keep working on that. And then what I found was that my style was more of a fast-paced, quick and punchy, funny story with a message, with a poignant message at the end. That was how my style evolved through the contest. And it's generally the style that I keep now, where I front load with humor. That way I'm establishing a rapport with the audience. I'm establishing the connection. And then once I've established that connection, I feel like I then have permission from the audience to go deeper. And that's what I do.
Overall, what is one thing everyone can take away from this?
One thing that people can take away from me. I think out of everything that I've said today, the one thing that I would want somebody to take away from me from this talk right now is, again, stand up, speak up. Theory is only going to take you so far. You need to be a mad scientist in the lab, and the lab needs to be a stage. Now, if that stage is a contest stage, if that stage is a presentation at work, if that stage is a pitch for Shark Tank or something like that, that's up to you to decide where your stage is. But at the end of the day, you have to stand up, you have to speak up, because then you're more likely to be seen.
And finally, what is one message on the curse and rise of competition?
With competition, you can't allow it to establish what your value is as a person or as a speaker. The contest is a gauge. Competition is a gauge. It is not the goal. That was the biggest lesson that I learned throughout my years of competing. And it's now the message that I tell others, because there are bigger things out there outside of the competitive speaking arena. What is that goal? What is it that you want to do? And then you need to think about, how can I use this competition to sharpen me so that I can achieve those goals? When you shift that mindset, then I feel like your growth is going to be exponential, because you're focusing on what's most important. You're focusing on the audience. You're focusing on what drives your audience. You're focusing on how you can communicate better to your audiences. So when you have that mindset shift, the world is your oyster.